I'll be reading from John 21:20 through 25. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper table and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
Thank you, Joey. And also, children K through grade 5 are dismissed for Children's Church. So just make sure, cover that detail. So good morning. It's good to be here this morning. So, last year I read 22 books. For some of you, that doesn't seem like many books at all. And for others of you, that seems like a ridiculous amount. This year, I'm well on my way to my goal of reading 30 books in 2017. I enjoy all kinds of genres, but some of my favorite books are memoirs. A memoir can be defined as a written account in which someone describes past experiences. To read another person's story is like visiting with them on a Sunday evening and just hearing about their lives. As I was preparing for today, I asked myself, what makes a good memoir? Obviously, a good plot helps, or the author has overcome some adversity in life. But sometimes I just enjoy stories that can transfer me into a different space, time, and perspective. Also important to a memoir is the inclusion of learning experiences, humor, as well as vulnerable moments. You know it's a good book when you can laugh while reading some pages and cry while reading others. As I was reading and studying these verses for today, I found this interaction between Peter and Jesus as directions for creating a powerful memoir. And while I know that most of us are probably not going to write our stories, but if you do, I know a good printer. But think of this message today as a way to write a great legacy. We're all going to leave something behind, and chances are all of you want to leave behind a good legacy or write a good memoir about your life. Verses 20 through 21 come directly after Peter is reinstated. He is no longer the one who betrayed Jesus, but Jesus is now telling him he will be the leader of the church. A holy moment for sure. And next Sunday, Pastor Bob will be speaking about this reinstatement. But to give a quick summary, Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times before Jesus' crucifixion, he relives his painful past. And it all starts sitting around the fire that Jesus cooked their breakfast on earlier in this chapter. And by that fire, perhaps Peter starts to think about the last time he was around a fire, denying that he had anything to do with Jesus. Then, after breakfast, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Each time, Peter is more pained as he relives his past action of denial. After those 3 questions, Jesus alludes to the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. What baffles me is Peter's response. I can just picture them taking a walk after breakfast along the shore. Jesus reinstates Peter in this holy moment. Then perhaps there's some silence as they walk. Maybe Peter doesn't know quite how to respond, but he looks back and he sees the disciple whom Jesus loved and decides it would be appropriate to ask, "Lord, what about him?" Peter is talking about this mysterious beloved disciple whom he has been connected with since the moment at the Last Supper when Peter told this beloved disciple to ask Jesus who would betray him. As I looked more into what is recorded about Peter, I found that this is not the first crazy response that Peter has had to something Jesus said or did. In Mark 9, 2-7, from the Message Bible, it says this: "After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain. His appearance changed from the inside out right before their eyes. His clothes shimmered, glistening white, whiter than any bleach could make them. Elijah, along with Moses, came into view in deep conversation with Jesus. Peter interrupted, 'Rabbi, this is a great moment. Let's build 3 memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah.' He blurted this out without thinking, stunned as they all were by what they were seeing. Just then, a light radiant cloud enveloped them, and from deep in the cloud a voice, 'This is my son, marked by my love. Listen to him.'" In the Believer's Church Bible Commentary, they rephrase Peter's response as, "Let us build 3 booths up here to preserve our cool experience." It's clear Peter didn't know what to say, and he just kind of said whatever came to mind to fill the silence. Another is in Mark 8, 31-33, directly after Peter confessed who Christ was. It says, "He," Jesus, "then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man." Peter confessed who Jesus was, then immediately doubted and rebuked Jesus. Webster's dictionary defines rebuke as speaking in an angry and critical way to someone, or to criticize sharply. And the most famous Peter story is found in Matthew 14, 28-31, of Peter walking on the water. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" It's safe to say Peter was a bit impulsive and did things and said things before thinking of their consequences. A trait that definitely has its pros and cons. But it sounds a bit like us sometimes, doesn't it? I read those 2 verses and thought to myself, really? That's how Peter, a disciple of Jesus, responds in that holy moment? Peter seemed to turn and ask about this disciple whom Jesus loved without even thinking. Peter was fully human, and I think this passage shows us that maybe he did say some dumb things, but Jesus still used him. In all honesty, I've had some holy moments recently where my responses were not the smoothest. Now, I'm going to be vulnerable here. I've been trying to laugh at myself more recently because I take myself way too seriously. So I don't usually go around telling stories like this, so here we go. In March, I had the privilege of going to Conestoga Christian School's Founders Dinner. They had Gracia Burnham come to speak. Gracia and her husband served as missionaries with New Tribes Mission in the Philippines. And they were captured by the Abu Sayyaf, which is a jihadist militant group. After her capture, they were toted all through the jungle by this group. Her book, In the Presence of My Enemies, tells of her time with the Abu Sayyaf. In the end, spoiler alert, she was rescued, but unfortunately her husband was shot and killed in their rescue. So at the founders' meal, she shared her story, and it was just powerful. One of the coolest things was that her captors are in jail, and she found some comic books that were about the Bible and Bible characters, and she brought them back into print. So she handed them to her captors. Some of the very people who had taken her hostage, she was keeping in touch with and praying for, and some have even become Christians. It is amazing how God works. So I was at the meal with our book club, most of whom read her book, and this is a picture of our book club. That's actually Gracia in the white and black there. So we got to meet her, which was really cool. So walking up the stairs in Shady Maple, I was thinking, okay, what do I say to someone who has been through so much? Like I said, or I can be a bit awkward sometimes, so sometimes I have to prepare my lines ahead of time so I don't blurt out complete nonsense. So I get into the line to meet her and have her sign my book that I just bought. And the lady ahead of me told Gracia that she was praying for her the entire time they were in captivity. I thought, okay, I can work off of that. And anyway, I don't have much time left. So it's my turn. I get up to her, and this is what I say. I'm handing her my book. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm sorry I wasn't praying for you while you were in captivity. I was in like 7th grade. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So afterwards, I'm like, really? Like, this woman just spoke about how God has worked in her life. And that's what I came up with. Clearly, I didn't have enough time to think through my opening line. Sometimes we experience holy moments, and like Peter, we don't know what to say or do. Sometimes after holy moments, we nail it with our responses, and other times we blow it. But good news, God still uses us, even us who make mistakes. Peter is a prime example of that. And as I've read and heard about people's lives, it's often the stories about mistakes or awkward moments that turn to growth that are so relatable and encouraging. Pass along those stories. In the memoir of your life, you never know who you are going to encourage with an embarrassing story of your life. The next 2 verses are Jesus' very patient response to Peter's question. Again, the Believer's Church Bible Commentary says, in essence, what Jesus says is, why be concerned about him? If it is my will that he live on after you die, even until I return, what is it to you? Follow me. Basically, mind your own business and follow me. The same commentary also said that at this point, Jesus was figuratively unhooking Peter from the beloved disciple, who Peter's been depending on since the Last Supper. And he wanted Peter to be his own person in Christ and fulfill the plan that Christ has for him. I think the message is pretty loud and clear. Don't worry about how God is going to work in someone else's life. Just keep following him. Now, I'm not saying don't be involved in the lives of others, but sometimes when in relationship with others, we feel it's our responsibility to help them. Or if we have a friend who doesn't believe in Christ, it's our responsibility to save them. I think that we are to do all that we can do, but ultimately God works how he works and does the real helping. And sometimes, praise God, we get to participate in that helping. But I find that especially in our spiritual lives, when someone is focused on Jesus and has this passion for following God, it is so contagious. At least for me, when I see someone finding truth and joy in the Bible or in worship, it inspires me and prompts me to seek God harder. So may it be with what we leave behind. I hope that the joy, fulfillment, hope, peace, love that we find in our walk with God would be so contagious to others. I took a youth ministry class this past spring through Eastern Mennonite Seminary. A story in the book Unchristian really impacted me. So this book is called Unchristian: What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity and Why It Matters. It's a really great read. Just maybe be ready to have your bubble burst if you do read this. So this one particular chapter is called Get Saved. And it's talking about how Christians are too concerned with converting people. And it includes this story. In asking about how Christians come across to people, we interviewed Stephen, a 34-year-old who moved to New York from Phoenix. During the interview, he described his initial excitement when he met a peer in an unfamiliar city. A young guy approached me in a subway station once, friendly, full of questions, interested in talking. He seemed really nice, and I couldn't believe a New Yorker was being so, well, nice. We exchanged numbers and said we'd hang out sometime. The next time I heard from him, he invited me to a Bible study, and that was all he wanted to talk about. When I said no thanks, I never heard from him again. Rather than being genuinely interested in people for their friendship, we often seem like spiritual headhunters. The biggest takeaway I had from this class was to love people and create relationships with others where they are at, both spiritually and physically. Maybe you have a friend that isn't ready to say yes to a Bible study. Perhaps eventually they will ask those tough questions about Christianity once a deep friendship is formed. We cannot control people, which is a tough lesson to learn. And sometimes we get rejected, but we are to keep focusing on God, and He will continue to lead us. Perhaps when Jesus was giving Peter his response, he had in the back of his mind what he said in Mark 12:30-31. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. Notice the order of that command. Love God with everything first, then love your neighbor. Another story that hit me in this class was when I was interviewing Scott Roth for my final paper on the world of video gamers. And he was talking about the people he meets over the internet through these games and how he ministers to them by just creating relationships with them. Then he began talking about loving your neighbor. And he said something that was profound yet simple. He said something like this: I love and care for my neighbors just as I would love anyone in the church. That statement really made me think of how I love others. I hope that in my memoir of life, I can say that I loved God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and out of that, I loved others. And I think that when you truly love others, there's not this element of control. I cannot control what people do with the gospel, where they will end up in life, or how people treat me or respond to me. I can control how I love people, how I encourage them when needed, and most of all, I can follow hard after God, because in the end, that's all that matters. Jesus beckoned Peter to not be concerned about others, but to just follow him. May your life be a testament of following Jesus first and loving your neighbor as yourself second. Verses 24 and 25 are highly disputed as to who wrote them. According to the IVP New Testament commentary, it is believed that the disciple whom Jesus loved, mentioned in the previous verses, was also the disciple who testifies to these things and wrote them down. The commentary goes on to say, as the author of this gospel, the beloved disciple fulfills Jesus' commission to those who were with him to be witnesses to him. As for the person who penned verse 25, it is believed to have been perhaps an editor or a scribe who kind of just chimed in at the end. This was most likely added later, as many commentators believe that chapter 21 was added at a later time. All that aside of who wrote what, I had to seriously pause after reading verse 25. It says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. What more could Jesus have done that was not recorded? Why were the stories about Jesus that are in the Bible included, while others are obviously excluded? I have no answers for these questions, but I do know one thing. It sure sounds like Jesus made the most of his time here on earth. Jesus came to earth with a clear goal to accomplish, and I'm sure every moment was spent walking towards this goal. He had to have used every waking moment, because apparently, if everything Jesus did was written down, the whole world would not have room for these books. God still works today through his Son and through his Holy Spirit. And what's even greater is that we can play a role in that work. So my ladies' Bible study just finished up the book of Daniel, where Beth Moore walked us through the prophecies and visions that Daniel received and interpreted about the end of times. Very challenging, but very rewarding. But it just amazes me that God has spelled out everything from beginning to end. While the details are a bit fuzzy about what exactly the end looks like, at least there is a created end of the story. So Beth Moore had this whole map of what history of, kind of the end times looks like, from the ascension to the end. So you can kind of see it here. And listed here, she has us in the church age. And that's according to how she views the end of times. So we're living in the church age. And fact is, we are a part of God's story, and we get the privilege of attesting to how he is at work in our lives and in those around us. And what a holy privilege it is. And this leads me to my final point of what makes a good memoir. We attest to the things we know that God has done in our lives. And we especially attest to those things that God has done in our lives that have been confirmed by those around us. We are still writing the story of how God moves, and we strive to fill this whole world with the books that we could write or the spoken legacies that we leave behind. I want to close with a story from one of the latest memoirs that actually our book club also read this. It's called The Tank Man's Son. And the section I'm about to read beautifully sums up how God used the author's dysfunctional life for good. Mark Bauman was the tank man's son, and eventually he served at an orphanage in Cambodia. He comes back to his hometown to give his testimony. He was supposed to, when he first agreed to this gig, he thought he was only going to talk about his time in Cambodia, but then the pastor urged him to share his entire testimony. And at this church, his once abusive father is sitting in the crowd listening to his testimony. So this is what it says. "Mark," the pastor said to me, "thank you for sharing with us this morning." With that, he sat down in the chair behind the pulpit. The congregation applauded. Each person there assumed the obvious narrative, a proud father watching his son preach. Except that for the next hour, I told them a different story. I tried to tell everyone sitting in the church as much of the truth as I could. I spoke about firing guns, driving the tank, living in the ship, and Dad blowing up a stump with dynamite. I recalled the feeling of Dad's hand and Dad's belt. I stalked again through the Grand River in search of turtles and heard Zeke's eager barking. I revisited Cambodia, witnessing orphans surprised by hope and finding a future they had never dared to dream of. With my father sitting not 50 feet from me, I spoke my way inside my own past. I lived each event as it emerged from my lips and relived it as I watched the crowd absorb what I was sharing. Finally, I realized my stories were finished. No one moved. I searched inside for what to say next, and I found the words were already waiting for me. I'm not just telling you these things to make someone in my family look bad. I just want you to know what God can do. If God can use me, then God can use anyone. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Our ramshackle home, our poverty, our good enough if it works existence, our injuries, our fights, our familiarity with chaos, even our abject fear and shame and the seemingly bottomless well from which Dad constantly supplied us. Hadn't all of that been used for good? Those things weren't good in and of themselves. Many were evil. Rather, my childhood had become good. It had been intended for evil, but transformed into good. Transformed by God, whose reservoir of grace made my father's well look like a child's bucket. I had become who I needed to become for the saving of many lives, not of the least, which was my own. Dad had been the unwitting agent of my remaking. From the boy I was into a father with his own 2 sons, and into papa for the children at the orphanage. I encourage you to record in whatever way you see fit. Record those holy moments in your life and how you respond to them, whether you respond really well or poorly, like Peter often did. I encourage you to keep following Christ and running the race without distractions. I encourage you to record your stories with brutal honesty and exactly how you see the stories unfold. Keep writing these stories so future generations can be inundated with what Jesus has done in our lives. And while you may think your life has been boring, I assure you it's not. Each one of you has a unique path and can very well be considered walking books. Praise God.